December 23rd, 2015. The air in the upscale suburbs of Ellington, Connecticut was thick with the quiet anticipation of the holidays. Wreaths hung on pristine doors, and freshly fallen snow blanketed the manicured lawns. It was supposed to be the start of a peaceful Christmas, but at 10:11 a.m., that fragile local silence was completely shattered. It didn't end with the wail of sirens, but with a single desperate call to 911. The man on the line was Richard Dabate. To the dispatcher, his voice sounded entirely erratic. He was shaking, practically gasping for air as he spoke into the receiver. Through the panic, he managed to articulate a nightmare. A terrifying, violent home invasion had just unfolded inside his house. According to Richard, a masked man, a towering figure standing 7 feet tall and dressed head to toe in tactical camouflage, had broken into his home. He described an absolute monster. This phantom intruder had supposedly bound Richard to a chair, threatened him with a box-cutter knife, and then, with cold, calculated precision, executed his wife, Connie, in the basement. To the first state troopers rushing through the snow to the scene, Richard Dabate wasn't a suspect. He was a survivor, a victim of a random, brutal act. They found him exactly as he had described, tied to a chair in the basement, covered in blood, and seemingly hysterical with grief. It was the perfect story of a senseless, random tragedy. But here is the reality of the 21st century. Modern justice doesn't rely on stories anymore. It relies on the invisible, silent witnesses that live in our pockets, rest on our wrists, and hum quietly in the walls of our homes. Richard believed he had left no traces. He believed, with the arrogance of an IT professional, that he had outsmarted the physical scene. But he forgot one fundamental law of the digital age. Every step we take in the modern world is tracked. Every pulse, every sudden movement, every microscopic packet of data transmitted by the device on your wrist is a permanent scar in the digital cloud. When homicide detectives finally pulled the encrypted logs from Connie's fitness tracker, they didn't find a 7-foot masked intruder. They found a ghost that kept walking, breathing, and moving through the house for nearly an entire hour after Richard claimed she was dead. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's an autopsy of a lie. A meticulously crafted lie that was systematically dismantled by 1,200 hidden digital steps. To understand the magnitude of the deception, you have to look at the facade Richard and Connie Dabate presented to the world. To their neighbors at 7 Birchview Drive, they were the quintessential American success story. Connie was 39 years old, a beloved pharmaceutical sales representative known for her infectious energy and dedication to her 2 young sons. Richard was a network administrator, a man who spent his professional life managing complex IT infrastructures. He was the guy who fixed the servers, routed the data, and understood the architecture of the internet. They had the big house, the stable jobs, the beautiful children. But behind the closed doors of their Ellington home, the reality was fracturing. When the police arrived that Friday morning, the scene was undeniably chaotic. But as the adrenaline of the initial response faded and the seasoned homicide detectives took over, the chaos started to feel different. It felt staged. Richard Dabate knew exactly how systems worked, and he used that specialized knowledge to build a timeline that seemed on the surface absolutely bulletproof. Let's look at the script Richard handed to the police. He told investigators that his day started normally. He left for work at 8:45 a.m. Connie was supposed to be at a fitness class, but shortly after leaving, Richard claimed he received a push notification on his smartphone, an automated alert from his home security system warning him that the house had been breached. He told the detectives he immediately panicked, turned his car around, and raced back to 7 Birchview Drive, arriving right around 9 a.m. That exact moment, he said, is when he walked into his home and encountered the intruder. Richard's description of the events in the basement was terrifying. He detailed a violent, desperate struggle. He claimed this massive, camouflaged intruder overpowered him, forced him into a metal folding chair, and bound his hands and feet tightly with plastic zip ties. The attacker then allegedly burned Richard with a blowtorch, leaving him completely incapacitated and helpless. While Richard was trapped downstairs, the intruder supposedly went back upstairs to hunt down Connie, who had just returned from the gym. Richard claimed he heard his wife enter the house, heard the struggle, and then heard the fatal gunshot that ended her life. It is a harrowing, deeply disturbing narrative. It's the kind of story designed to bypass logic and elicit immediate, uncritical empathy from anyone listening. But forensics do not feel empathy. For the lead detectives processing the scene, Richard's flawless story started showing massive, gaping cracks within mere hours. First, there was the physical environment. A home invasion by a chaotic, violent intruder usually leaves a messy, unpredictable physical signature. But at the Dabate residence, detectives didn't see any signs of a forced entry at the front door. In fact, the house was locked tight. Furthermore, it was late December in New England. The ground was covered in fresh snow. Yet, this 7-foot-tall, heavily armed intruder had supposedly vanished into thin air, leaving absolutely no footprints in the snow outside the house. Inside, the forensic team scoured the basement and the main floors. There was no foreign DNA. There were no strange fingerprints. Even the family's dogs, who were in the house the entire time, showed no signs of distress or agitation, behavior highly unusual if a giant stranger had just tortured their owner and murdered his wife. To the trained eye, everything was perfect. It was simply too perfect. The physical crime scene didn't feel like a tragic, random event. It felt like a storyboard. It was a series of carefully arranged props laid out exactly as a layman would expect a Hollywood home invasion to look. The detectives shifted their strategy. They realized they weren't just investigating a murder scene anymore. They were investigating a carefully written script. They began to record every word, every subtle stutter, and every micro inconsistency in Richard's testimony. Law enforcement knows that in our modern, hyper-connected digital age, a liar's biggest enemy isn't a lie detector test, and it isn't even the truth. It's the metadata. While Richard Dabate was busy manipulating the physical stage, knocking over a chair, lightly burning himself, scattering zip ties, he suffered from a fatal blind spot. He failed to realize that his own home was actively watching him. The house was a digital fortress, logging his every move, his every wireless signal, and his every heartbeat. Remember, Richard Dabate was a network administrator. He understood local area networks, server infrastructures, protocols, and exactly how data packets travel from a device to a router and out to the wider world. He arrogantly assumed that as long as he controlled the physical space of his home, he controlled the entire narrative. But he vastly underestimated the unbiased biographer that now lives inside every modern American home. The invisible digital infrastructure. The trap he built for himself snapped shut on two undeniable fronts. First, let's look at the Wi-Fi. According to Richard's rigid timeline, by 9:04 a.m., he was in the basement, fully incapacitated, tied hand and foot to a metal chair by the camouflage-wearing giant. He couldn't move, yet digital forensics extracted the logs from his home router. At exactly 9:04 a.m., Richard's personal iPhone, which was sitting somewhere else in the house, initiated an active data transfer to log into his Facebook account. The investigators stared at the logs. How does a man, bound hand and foot and allegedly fearing for his life, log into a social media network? When confronted with this impossibility later, Richard scrambled. He tried to claim it was an accidental bump in his pocket, or perhaps a delayed background sync error by the app. But network traffic analysis is precise. The data packets sent to the Facebook servers were categorical. This wasn't a background refresh. It was a manual, intentional human interaction with the device. He was scrolling, but the Facebook login was just the tip of the iceberg. The ultimate undoing of Richard Dabate came from his own wife's wrist. Then there was Connie's Fitbit. A Fitbit isn't just a pedometer. It uses a 3-axis accelerometer to understand motion patterns and photoplethysmography, flashing green LEDs to continuously measure the volume of blood passing through the capillaries in the wrist, providing a constant minute-by-minute log of a person's heart rate. This small, unassuming piece of plastic and silicon became the state of Connecticut's star witness. According to Richard's carefully crafted, tear-filled script, Connie had entered the house, encountered the intruder, and had been murdered in the basement at exactly 9:05 a.m. In his version of the universe, the house went completely silent immediately after that gunshot, but the Fitbit didn't lie. When forensic experts subpoenaed the data from the cloud servers, the truth was illuminated in stark, undeniable numbers. At 9:05 a.m., Connie Dabate was very much alive. In fact, her heart rate was elevated, and her device recorded active, continuous steps for an entire hour after Richard claimed she was dead. The accelerometer data painted a vivid, chilling picture of her actual morning. She wasn't lying dead in the basement. She was actively walking from the garage, moving around the first floor and navigating from room to room. And she was doing all of this while her husband was purportedly downstairs, being tortured by a 7-foot-tall stranger. When the digital forensic analysts presented this to the homicide investigators, they watched the data in sheer disbelief. They realized they weren't looking at a crime scene anymore. They were looking at a digital replay. They saw Connie's final movements on Earth, meticulously measured in paces and heartbeats. This data conclusively proved that the man sitting in the hospital pretending to be a grieving husband was actually the last person to witness her alive. The camouflage-wearing intruder was a complete fabrication. The entire timeline Richard had built was a cage. And Richard Dabate, the network administrator, had just locked himself inside it. But why? Why would a seemingly successful man orchestrate the brutal execution of his wife? Detectives soon uncovered the dark underbelly of Richard's life. He wasn't just living a lie on the day of the murder, he had been living a lie for years. Richard had a secret he was desperately keeping from Connie, a pregnant mistress. He was living a double life, draining bank accounts and facing the immense financial and social pressure of a looming divorce. He wanted to restart his life without the burdens, both financial and familial, of the one he had already destroyed. Instead of a divorce, he chose murder, hoping a staged home invasion would leave him with a clean slate and life insurance payouts. Armed with both the motive and the irrefutable digital data, the police brought Richard in. But they didn't show their hand immediately. Police waited. They sat across from him in that cold room and let Richard retell his fabricated story 3, 4, 5 times. They wanted to see if he would deviate under pressure. He didn't. He stuck rigidly to the intruder narrative. He spoke with the calm, practiced confidence of a man who genuinely thought he'd covered every base. He was a tech guy. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. But then, the atmosphere in the interrogation room fundamentally shifted. The lead detective didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He didn't aggressively accuse him. He simply took a single sheet of paper and slid it slowly across the metal table. It was the data log, the exact timestamps, the recorded steps. Detective: Richard, we've analyzed your home's digital footprint. It doesn't align with your story, not even close. If you watch the interrogation tape, watch his face in this exact second. This is the precise moment the network administrator realized he wasn't just losing an argument with a cop, he was losing his life. When confronted with the incontrovertible walking data from his dead wife's wrist, his demeanor didn't just change, it completely collapsed. Richard: I don't know. Maybe it was a glitch? Maybe the device picked up movement from the dog? A glitch, a dog, a hardware malfunction. The excuses pouring out of his mouth were desperate, pathetic, and nonsensical. He was an IT professional trying to debug his own crime in real time, sweating under the fluorescent lights. But the software of reality didn't have a patch for murder. The detective leaned in close, his voice low and incredibly steady. Detective. Richard, the Fitbit tracked her heart rate, her steps, and her movement through the basement for 55 minutes after you said she was killed. She was dying, and you were the only one there. All the arrogant confidence completely evaporated. The terrifying 7-foot-tall phantom intruder he'd invented was gone forever, instantly replaced by the crushing, suffocating weight of the digital evidence. Richard sat back in that chair, no longer acting as a traumatized victim, but finally exposed as a man who had meticulously built a digital prison for himself. And now he was permanently trapped inside it. The trial that followed wasn't just a standard legal proceeding, it was a technological reckoning for the criminal justice system. For years, Richard's defense attorneys tried everything to argue against the invisible data. They brought in experts to claim fitness trackers were notoriously inaccurate, that the Wi-Fi logs could be spoofed, that the technology shouldn't be trusted over a man's sworn testimony. But the digital trail was absolute. It was unbiased, untampered, and overwhelming. In May 2022, after a grueling legal process, the jury looked at the data and returned the only verdict that the evidence allowed: guilty. Richard Dabate was sentenced to 65 years in state prison. His motive was laid bare before the court: the secret he had kept from his wife, the pregnancy with another woman, and a briefcase full of selfish desires to restart his life without the burdens of the one he had violently destroyed. He truly thought he was the smartest person in the room. He thought, just like fixing a computer network, he could manipulate the physical logs, reset the variables of his life, and simply delete the past. We build our modern lives around the supreme convenience of these digital connections. We strap monitors to our wrists to count our calories. We install smart alarms to protect our doors. And we carry computers in our pockets that know exactly where we are every second of the day. But we often forget that every sensor, every router login, and every measured heartbeat is an unbiased biographer. We are leaving an invisible, permanent trail behind us every single day. For Richard Dabate, the cloud didn't just store his fitness data or his security alerts, it recorded his ultimate downfall. The truth doesn't just hide in the physical shadows anymore. Today, it lives forever in the data. Thank you for watching Forensic Mind. If you value the truth hidden in the digital footprints, hit that subscribe button and join us next week as we untangle the next case. Stay analytical.